Boldwood presents Shooting Stars Over Bluebell Cliff, written by Della Galton and read by Laura Kerman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Poppy Allen took a gulp of the fresh, brine-scented air and shielded her eyes against the winter sunshine as she looked out across the strip of pale sand. It was warm for February, and the sea was flat and calm. She wasn't the only one making the most of the stunning early morning weather. Out in the bay, a small boat towed a water skier in a black wetsuit past Old Harry Rocks. He bounced across the Navy Sea, and Poppy could hear the distant drone of the boat's engine beneath the mewling cries of the gulls. Her ankle boots sank into the powdery sand as she twirled slowly around. Wow, this was a beautiful location to film. In her mind's eye, she saw a pair of chestnut horses cantering in slow motion through the surf into a sunset that painted the sky pink and gold and turned the sea all around into a mirror of rose-tinted glass. Which way was west? She checked her smartphone. Oh, God, it was perfect. The sun would set over Brown Sea Island. They might be able to use this very stretch of beach for that part of her show. People raved about Dorset's beaches. Bournemouth drew the crowds, but in her opinion, Studland Beach was better. It was wilder, with no neat prom and no pier. Just a backdrop of sand dunes dotted with scrubby grass that stretched away into the distance. It was so much more romantic than its staid sister, Bournemouth, certainly for what she had in mind. Date for a Day, a new kind of dating show, was Poppy's brainchild. Billed as a cross between Take Me Out and It's a Knockout, it involved 7 contestants participating in challenges to win the attention of the picker. Netflix had commissioned a pilot that would be shown in the autumn. Poppy was determined to make it a hit. Being a producer was all she'd ever wanted to do, and she was passionate about her work. Poppy turned back towards the chain ferry, which was docking again. It came from sandbanks 3 times an hour, and the crossing took 4 minutes. From her flat on Poole Quay, it was quicker to come by ferry. The alternative was a very scenic 40-minute drive, on a good day, through Wareham and the Isle of Purbeck. The ferry disgorged a handful of cars from the 9 a.m. crossing. She'd got the one before. She never slept much past dawn anyway. Dave would probably be on this one. It had been tricky to get him to agree to such an early start, especially as he was, technically, working for nothing today. This was a pre-recce excursion, prior to bringing in her full crew. She could have done it by herself, but she wanted a sounding board, and Dave had agreed to keep her company after she'd caught him in a weak moment last week following a shoot. She'd known Dave Blackwell for a lot longer than he'd been her preferred director of photography. They had worked for other production companies together before she'd set up her own Beauty Spot Productions 18 months ago, and they'd become good friends. There was no one she trusted more to help her bring her dream to life. Poppy felt a prickle of excitement run down her back as she looked around her. It might be too busy to film here, but there were other more secluded, even more beautiful beaches in this bay. She glanced back towards the National Trust car park and saw Dave's old black Mercedes pulling in and parking beside her metallic silver Jeep Renegade. Too impatient to wait, she set off to meet him. Dave was frowning as he negotiated sticks of driftwood and the odd bit of dried-out seaweed, scattered by the breeze blowing off the sea. They met halfway. "Hey, honey, you been here long?" He yawned and wrinkled up his nose. "That seaweed pongs a bit. I'd forgotten that smell. It takes me straight back to childhood, lobster pot, seaweed and fish and chips." "You surely cannot smell fish and chips," she challenged, knowing his fondness for them. "No, I can't. It's wishful thinking. I missed breakfast." He had a camera slung over his shoulder and was wearing the dark chinos, polo neck and windbreaker jacket he always wore when he was working. The beginnings of a stubbly beard were just starting to speckle with grey, in contrast to his hair that was still a dark brown. Not that there was very much of it. He wore it close-cropped. Dave was 37 but looked younger. Boyish was a word that could have been invented for him. Poppy was 33 and looked younger too, and she secretly hated it because she felt people didn't always take her seriously. They often pointed out she had a passing resemblance to Taylor Swift. It was true she had blonde hair and delicate features, but Poppy did her best to offset her ultra-feminine appearance with biker-style boots and chunky jackets, and she wore barely any makeup. Calling someone a dumb blonde was a sackable offence these days, so no one ever tried it, but she knew it was still there, the blonde preconceptions lurking beneath the polite smiles. Her looks could be a disadvantage in her profession. She was aware that she worked twice as hard sometimes to compensate for any possible blonde prejudice. "Cool boots," Dave said. "Thanks." Dave was the kind of guy who noticed details. He noticed everything. Part of a cameraman's job, she'd often thought. Being observant had to be second nature. He looked around then. "Stunning bit of shoreline. Welcome to the Jurassic Coast, a World Heritage Site. This is the only place on Earth where 185 million years of the Earth's history are sequentially exposed. You can literally walk along the coastline and see rock formations from 250 million years ago." "You sound like you're quoting from a travel brochure." "I am, as it happens, but I'm really proud of my home. Have you really never been here before?" "Bit far off the beaten track for us. I was brought up in Portsmouth. Our nearest beach was Western Hard, or Calshot if we wanted to be posh. To be honest, my parents weren't big beach fans. Mine were. We used to come here a lot when we were kids. I have the most brilliant memories." "It's pretty. Looks safe too." He glanced at the water skier. "Lots to do, I'm guessing. I've always fancied a go at that." "Have you really?" "Yeah, I have, as it happens." "Don't look so surprised." "I thought you preferred watching sport on a big screen in the pub to doing it." "I go to the gym." "You've got a gym membership. That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" He sucked in his breath and patted his stomach. "You know me so well. But I would like a go at that water skiing lark. How hard can it be?" "Once you've mastered the art of standing up, it's not that hard. The boat does all the work." "You never said you water skied." There was admiration in his eyes. "I know how to do it. Certainly not an expert." A gust of sea breeze lifted Poppy's mane of tawny blonde hair, which had escaped from the collar of her jacket. She should have tied it back. "I was really lucky to grow up here. I bet it's gorgeous in the summer." He rubbed his hands together. "It's not that warm today, though, is it? Shall we go and check out the rest of these beauty spots, then? As the one with the local knowledge, is there anything I need to be aware of?" "There's a naturist beach further along," Poppy pointed, "but it's well signposted." "Excellent. Shall we have lunch there?" "I'm fine with a picnic lunch on the beach. In the interest of saving money, of course." His eyes sparked with humour. Poppy gave him a mock-stern look. "Get your mind out of the gutter, Dave Blackwell. No, we shall not. It's too cold for shedding clothes." "True. We can save that for spring. I've heard there's going to be a heatwave in April." "In your dreams." He laughed, and she knew they were both comfortable with the banter and flirting that had become second nature in the 5 years she'd known him. Sometimes she wondered what would happen if either of them tried to take it further, but this had never been put to the test. Partly, she suspected, because she saw him in much the same light as she saw her elder brothers, Mickey and Lennox, and she was pretty sure he saw her in a similar way. Once, on a drunken evening out after a shoot about a year ago, they'd been the last two in the pub, and Dave had leaned towards her, clearly having trouble focusing, and said, "I love you, Poppy Allen." She hadn't been quite as drunk as him, and she'd narrowed her eyes. "Is that so?" "I do. I mean it. I'm not messing with you. You're lovely, you are. You're like the beautifulest, loveliest little shitzer I never had." "I love you too," she had said, in a strictly platonic, lovely older cousin kind of way. He'd screwed up his face and had one more attempt at trying to focus before falling off his bar stool. She'd called a taxi and poured him into it and sent him home. They had never got quite that drunk again, and neither of them had ever referred to it either. Now Poppy cleared her throat. I only mentioned the naturist beach because I don't want you getting any untoward images in the background when you're shooting. Right you are, boss. I'll look out for stray nudists. He doffed an imaginary cap. Let's have a proper recce then. I'm assuming you don't want to film this close to the ferry. You assume right. This beach runs all the way round to Old Harry Rocks. It's called different things depending on which bit you're on. Further round, there's Knoll Beach, South Beach and Middle Beach. They're mostly sandy from memory. How's the access? There are National Trust car parks, so we won't have too far to lug equipment, but some are closer than others. That's one of the things I want to check. So, to be clear, today we are looking for picnic locations, horse riding locations, and water skiing locations. Precisely. She led him back towards the ferry until they were standing a short way from the strip of road. The sea tucked into the bay on the other side of them. The beach over there is beautiful too. There's not much of it. Lots of marsh grass and dunes, and there are a few houseboats moored up, but it's picturesque and quieter than this side, she pointed. You see that little island out there covered in trees? That's Brownsea. Isn't that something to do with the Scouts and Baden-Powell? Yes, I think the Scout movement actually started there. They first camped there in 1907. Apparently Baden-Powell wanted to test out his ideas for a book, Scouting for Boys. These days, it's owned by the National Trust. You're very well informed. What's the posh castle? That was originally built in the 16th century by Henry VIII as a fort. By the time the National Trust bought Brownsea in the mid-1960s, it was in quite a state, and they leased it to John Lewis, who restored it. As in, John Lewis, the department store. Yep. I think they use it for staff. It's not open to the public. Anyway, you need a licence to land at Brownsea and permission from the National Trust to film there. Getting the kit across would be dependent on the weather. True, but a castle's a great backdrop for romance. Brownsea also has a reputation for midges. I got eaten alive last time I went. Not so good. A romantic picnic on the beach with midges taking chunks out of you. He rubbed his arms. They always get me as well. Tides, midges and weather would make for interesting risk-ass forms. The risk assessment forms, or risk-ass forms, as Dave always called them, were going to be interesting enough already. What are the other options for the picnic? Dave asked. Corfe Castle. It's just ruins, but it's spectacular. A pile of monolithic grey stones high up on a hill. It's an iconic landmark, but you can't see the sea from there. I really want the sea in the background. Durdle Door's a strong possibility. That's a 200-foot high arch that's been eroded into rock. The sea whizzes through it and hurls spray everywhere, and every so often it makes the news because crazy teenagers tombstone off the top. You must have heard of Durdle Door. Poppy shot him a questioning look. They've made some classic films there. I'm aware of Durdle Door, although I haven't been there for a while. We can check that out later. Shall we have a closer look at these beaches first? I think we'll have our couple riding along one of them. You have to admit, that would look great, wouldn't it? Very romantic. A pair of horses in slow motion, splashing through the surf. He rolled his eyes. She already knew he had reservations about the riding part of the date, but then he wasn't yet privy to all of the information she had. You're the boss. As they strolled along the shoreline, they chatted about the job in hand. Film had always been Poppy's passion. After taking a degree in media and journalism and 9 years of doing various jobs, from runner to serious producer for broadcasters and big production companies, she'd set up Beauty Spot, but the Netflix pilot was her first big break. It had taken a lot of determination and a lot of calling in favours to get it this far. A reality dating show wasn't exactly an original concept, but in its favour, dating shows were eternally popular, and they did pull in the ratings. Plus, Poppy was excellent at her job and very persuasive. The pilot would be a low-budget production. The only reason she could do it at all was because she knew so many people who were willing to provide their services for next to nothing, on the understanding they'd get future work on the series. The premise for Date for a Day was simple. One man or woman chooses a date from 7 hopefuls who are narrowed down based on a series of challenges they have to perform. The date itself would also involve challenges. On the pilot episode, the couple would take part in 2 seaside activities, water skiing and a beach ride. The idea being that they got the chance to see each other under pressure. It wasn't all hard work, though. In between challenges, they'd be treated to a picnic on the beach and a slap-up meal at a cliff-top hotel, at the end of which they'd announce live on air whether they wanted to see each other again, or whether it really had been just a date for a day. When they'd been walking for a few minutes, Dave said, "Did you say it's a female contestant choosing a date for the pilot?" "I did, yes." "So she'll be picking from 7 guys?" "Not much gets past you." He shot her a mock-injured look. "To be fair, that's not always the case these days. Women don't always pick guys." "Well, it is the case in my pilot. Even Naked Attraction didn't mix it up too much until Series 2. Didn't you say one of the challenges was cooking their signature dish in 10 minutes? You can barely boil an egg in 10 minutes. You can boil an egg in 3 minutes, Dave. Fact. Well, okay, an omelette then. You need time to prepare the ingredients. That'll be done in advance. Look, I know it's tight, but it's doable. I've done a lot of research, and it'll be hilarious to watch." "Yeah, that's true. I'm guessing there are plenty of contenders who are up for being humiliated in public." "Yep, people will do anything for their 15 minutes of fame. Well, it will be more like 2 minutes in the final reckoning, but I had no shortage of takers." "Have you got all the contenders lined up?" "Almost. A lot of them came through social media, but I also ran an advert on Star Now. That closes this week. I've already picked the girl who'll be doing the choosing for the pilot." He whistled through his teeth. "Respect. She's someone I know. So at least you know she's reliable." "Oh, she is. I'll tell you about her later." "Remind me what the other challenges are." "They're more straightforward. The first one is called Picture Me. Each prospective date has to sum himself up in a sentence. My girl then eliminates 3 of them. They'll have time to do that one in advance. All they have to do is remember their sentence. The second challenge is the cooking. There'll be 4 guys doing that. This time, she has to eliminate 2 of them. Then we're down to the last 2 for the final challenge. That's the one where they perform their party piece. Exactly. They have 90 seconds to impress her. You can't do much of a party piece in 90 seconds. What if they want to play Moonlight Sonata on a baby grand piano? I was hoping they'd do something more fun, like, I don't know. She pretended to consider it carefully. Some cartwheels and a couple of backflips, or juggle some fiery torches or something? Juggle fiery torches. Have we got enough insurance for that? I'm sure we could get it. Don't forget, we'll be filming all this at the Bluebell Cliff Hotel. It's quite a special venue. Unique, I think. Certainly on the south coast. In what respect? Well, the Bluebell Cliff's mission statement is, "We're here to help you make your dreams come true," or words to that effect. They're good at it too if you look at all the press coverage they get. That's the reason I picked it. They're totally set up for people doing crazy stuff on their premises. A beat. Actually, if someone wanted to play Moonlight Sonata on the grand piano for their party piece, they could do it. The Bluebell Cliff has a grand piano. You've thought this through. When do I not? She slanted him a smug glance. They also have an amphitheatre, a lighthouse, and a bluebell wood. That would be picturesque, although we might be a bit early for the bluebells as we're shooting at the end of March. But it's a fantastic location, on top of a cliff. You can almost see it from here." They'd walked a fair distance around the bay as they'd been talking, and now Poppy shielded her eyes against the sun and pointed towards Old Harry Rocks. "You see those great chunks of white rock on the headland, sticking up out of the sea?" "Yeah, they're pretty impressive bits of rock. Are they chalk? I'm guessing they broke off the cliff at some stage." "Yes, they're chalk, and yes, they broke off the cliff if you're a geologist. The more mystical explanation is that they're named after the devil and his wife, who once sat there for a nap. He's the big one, and the smaller one's his wife. Wife number 2. I think the other bit of rock might be wife number 1. The devil's had more than one wife." Dave eyed her speculatively. "How does that work, then?" "Don't ask me. I'm just repeating the legend." "A pretty cool legend." "It entertains the tourists. There's also a story that says the rocks are named after a pirate called Harry Pay, who made a career out of attacking merchant ships that sailed in and out of Poole Harbour. Who knows?" She spread her hands. "Anyway, if you go up from there, you can just about see the hotel, the white building. That's the Bluebell Cliff." "Wow, I'm impressed." "They have a state-of-the-art kitchen. That's where we'll be filming the cooking scenes. Clara's a sweetie, and she is definitely up for a bit of madness and mayhem. I managed to negotiate a really good deal because of the nature of our project." She tapped her nose. "What could be a better dream come true than meeting your soulmate? Not to mention the fact we'll be filming the happy couple there too over dinner for some old-fashioned schmoozing. What's not to like?" Dave laughed. "That's pretty romantic for someone who's sworn off men for the decade." "I haven't sworn off men, just commitment and settling down." She shuddered melodramatically. "Because that ship's definitely sailed. A very apt saying in our current surroundings." She shot him a look, and he held up his hands. "Okay, no more romance gags. Vicarious romance suits me very well, too. Is the Bluebell Cliff a romantic enough venue?" "I think so. You can give me your opinion later. We're booked in there for dinner. They do very good food, I'm told." "How early can we go? I'm starving." Chapter 2. As they got closer to South Beach, Poppy thought she could smell coffee and frying bacon carried on the coastal breeze. "Is that my imagination, or is someone cooking breakfast?" Dave sniffed appreciatively. "You're not imagining it, unless I am too, and I don't think there's quite enough sand around here for a mirage." "Hey, it's a cafe," he said in delight as they rounded a bend into a small cove and came across a row of modest-looking, ramshackle beach huts with grass growing in front of them, set back from the sea up on an elevated ridge. Joe's cafe-cum-beach shack turned out to have a tiny raised-decked area housing a couple of wooden picnic benches, and the driftwood sign proclaimed it to be open. They bought bacon butties and Americanos and took them back onto the small beach, where they perched on a slab of rock and looked out across a flat, calm sea that was part grey, part silver, part turquoise. A smattering of gulls wheeled and circled above it. But there weren't many people about on this February Friday. They'd met a few dog walkers, but the water skier had disappeared. Above the bay, the sky was blue, patterned with a lacework of small clouds, and there were no sounds but for the whisper of a breeze through the trees in the small wooded area behind them, and the odd call of a lazy gull. "It's not a bad job, is it?" Dave said, finishing his butty and resting back on his elbows on the rock. "Sometimes I think about all those people hunched over their desks in offices, breathing in sterile air and looking at the clock, wishing their lives away." "They won't be working at 8 p.m. tonight, though, will they? They'll probably be in the pub." "I'm planning on being in the pub at 8 p.m. myself. It'll be nice down here when it's warmer, having a barbecue outside your own beach hut." He gestured to the ones they'd just walked past. They were all shuttered and boarded, but when they were opened up for the summer, they'd have one of the best views on earth. "How do you get to hire one of those?" "You don't. They're owned, and you'd practically have to be born into the family to get one, or inherit one." She spread her hands. Someone would probably have to expire before you got one. I think that's just become my new ambition in life, getting to inherit a beach hut. Yep, but you'd get bored if you weren't living in the hustle and bustle of a town. Studland would be too quiet for you. Yeah, you're probably right, but I'm loving the view. Like her, Dave preferred the convenience of a town. He'd moved from Portsmouth to Poole when he'd gone to uni and never gone back. Now he lived at Camford Heath, a modern estate not far from her. His house overlooked Heathland. She'd picked him up from there often when they were working. Which was best, a full-on Heathland view or a harbour glimpse? It was a subject they'd debated before. Her Poole Quay apartment had harbour glimpses. The estate agent had coined the description harbour glimpses when he'd sold it to her, and glimpses was the operative word. You had to be standing on tiptoe and leaning out of the tiny bathroom window to catch a peek of the harbour. On a good day, you could see the flash of the sunshine on water. On a bad day, you twisted your neck and got cobwebs in your hair. On the plus side, the quay was only a few hundred metres from her front door, and the apartment had also been tens of thousands cheaper than a place with full-blown sea views. Poppy hadn't been able to resist. She adored the sea. She'd been born and brought up in Poole. Her whole family was still local. None of them had moved that far from the coast. The sea was like that. It got into your blood. When they were kids, her father had claimed he had salt water running around his veins. Poppy had always suspected this to be true. He'd worked in the boatyard, and at night he'd been a volunteer lifeboatman, like his father before him. One of her earliest and most vivid memories was of going cockling with her dad and her brothers, Mickey and Lennox, at Evening Hill, which was the section of sea on the sandbank side of this bay. When the tide went out at Evening Hill, it stayed shallow enough for you to walk out for miles, or at least that's what it had seemed like to Poppy in those far-off golden days. She and her brothers would each have a bucket and spade, and they'd forage for the cockles in the soft, wet sand. It was so exciting to find one and put it in the bucket and know they'd be eating it later for tea. Occasionally they'd come across a hermit crab too, scuttling away from their probing fingers, or a shoal of tiny fish scattering in the clear, shallow water. She must have been about 6 because she didn't remember Rose, her younger sister, being there, or her mother. They must have been back at home. Rose would only have been little. There were just over 3 years between them. But Poppy remembered feeling so grown up and proud to be going out with the men, being trusted to get the cockles for tea. When she got tired, her father, a stocky giant of a man with arms that were hard as rock from hauling boats around, would hoist her up on his shoulders as though she weighed nothing at all. It had felt like being on top of the world. Once he'd pointed out a little orange boat in the distance, skimming across the water with a crew of men in yellow high-vis jackets, visible against the spray. "That's the boat your daddy goes out in to rescue people," he'd said, and she and her brothers had shielded their eyes to look. But she'd had the best view, because she'd been sitting on top of the world. Poppy was 10 when she lost her father. He'd caught pneumonia after a lifeboat rescue, and died in hospital a few days later from complications caused by a faulty valve in his heart. No one could have foreseen the tragedy. No one could have guessed that her father's heart, which Poppy had always thought must be as big and bold and brave as the rest of him, had been seriously faulty. She had never blamed the sea for his death. Neither had Eleanor, her mother. He'd adored the sea. "Your daddy lived his life to the full. He loved every moment. We should honour that," Eleanor had said after the funeral as she hugged her young family tightly. "And we should always try to do the same." Poppy knew her brothers still had the same love of the sea as she did, or at least Mikey did. Lennox was less enamoured. He'd trained up for the lifeboat service, but after an unfortunate incident when he'd got tangled up in an anchor rope and knocked himself out, he'd withdrawn his services. Despite all this, Poppy knew she would never go far from the sea. She would have felt landlocked if she hadn't lived near water, even if she did just have a glimpse. She and Dave finished their breakfast and strolled back up to the cafe to find their litter bin. On the way, Dave paused to pick up a plastic bag blowing along the shingle. He rolled it up with his breakfast serviette and put that in the bin too. They had the same ethics, Poppy observed, glancing at him. They both cared. That was another thing she liked about him. They took Poppy's jeep to Durdledore. "It's senseless having two vehicles polluting the atmosphere," she said as they sped along Ferry Road back towards Swanage. She much preferred driving to being driven. "And we've got to come back this way for the hotel. In the summer, this road gets gridlocked, but we should be all right today." "Will it be all right in March? When's Easter?" "It's late, not until the middle of April, so fingers crossed, unless we really are having a heat wave in spring." "Are we?" He winked. "Hope so. I could do with an all-over tan. I thought you were planning on going water skiing in your spare time." "You may as well, while we've got the use of a boat and an instructor." "Yeah, that's true. I might not have time to do any actual filming." He clicked his tongue. "On the subject of filming, I've been in touch with the owner of a riding stables who does beach rides, and she's very keen to get involved." "What if your winning contestant can't ride or is allergic to horses or something? Are we hiring a stunt double?" "No, because that would defeat the object. It's a riding challenge. Anyway, we won't need to, because they can all ride. Or at least they said they could on the application form. I made it clear it was a requirement. They don't need to be an expert or anything," she added, seeing his surprise. "They just need to look okay on a horse. We can do some fancy footwork with the edits if necessary." "More nightmare risk-ass forms," he grumbled. "I don't know why I was worried about fire juggling." 3/4 of an hour later, they were at Durdledore. Poppy drew up in a huge car park that wasn't much more than a cliff-top field. It was much breezier than it had been at Studland. The sea, far below them, was flecked with white horses. "You're not scared of heights, are you?" Poppy asked Dave as they got closer to the unfenced edge. "Course not," he said, taking a cautious couple of steps nearer to the sheer drop and then reversing backwards sharply. "But I take it we're not abseiling down." "The path's pretty steep." "You can hold my hand if you get scared." "I'll bear that in mind." As they walked down the rough-hewn path and the famous arch-shaped rock formation came suddenly into view, she heard Dave's gasp of appreciation. "Wow, now that really is something. I have been here before, but it never ceases to amaze me. The sheer scale of that arch." "It's impressive, isn't it?" she said, pleased at the admiration in his voice as they both paused to stare at the colossal arch in the rocks, which jutted out from the beach a long way below. The sea was laced with foam as it washed through and around the arch, and from this vantage point they could also see the golden curve of sand hugging the cliffs. "Now that's what I call a picnic location," Dave added. "Forget Brownsea. Let's have the picnic here. That would be fabulous to film. In fact, I've seen it in a film. Hang on, don't tell me." She waited, and a few moments later his face cleared. "Nanny McPhee, 2005. Emma Thompson was in it, if my memory serves me correctly." "Spot on. Produced by Lindsay Doran and Tim Bevan. They also filmed some of Thomas Hardy's Far From the Madding Crowd here." "So it's no stranger to film crews, then. That should help with the paperwork." "Intrepid film crews," Poppy said. "Do you think Mike will get down there okay?" She pictured their sound guy, who at 52 was the most senior member of her team. Mike lived on a diet of Pringles, Doritos and jammed donuts, and was proud of the fact that he could use his belly as a shelf for a takeaway Costa coffee when he was sitting down. "Mike's fitter than he looks. Anyway, it's not the getting down that will be a problem, it's the getting back up again. Our happy daters will need to be pretty fit too." "Are we going down?" she asked him. "Or are you okay to view it from up here?" "Are you calling me a lightweight? Of course we're going down." He was ahead of her now, clearly inspired. On the beach, he paced about, trying out various shots. Does the sea come right in? We'd better get a tide table. But it is perfect. There shouldn't be too many holidaymakers in March either. It's definitely not Easter. Nope, we'll be done by the 3rd of April. No midges either. She looked at him. Definitely here then. Picnic location sorted. I'd say so. The rest of the afternoon was spent visiting various other beauty spots, just to confirm they'd picked the best ones. They had, and there was a lot of laughter. Poppy had booked a table for 6 p.m. at the Bluebell Cliff Hotel, and they arrived there in convoy a few minutes earlier. Aware that Dave was on the phone in his car, she took the time to make notes in her folder. Today they had earmarked locations for the beach ride and the water skiing, Studland Bay, which beach depended on tides, and the picnic, Durdledore. There was plenty of time to get the necessary permissions and licences and do the risk assessments. Everything else would be shot indoors. The Bluebell Cliff was perfect for the studio segments. They'd set up a makeshift studio in the ballroom, and the cooking section would be filmed in the kitchens. The banging of Dave's car door alerted her to the fact he was done on the phone and ready to go. "Nice bit of Art Deco," he said, stepping back to take a look up at the pale white walls of the hotel as they walked across the dark car park. "Very photogenic. Are we planning to do anything with the lighthouse? Abseiling down it, climbing up it? Hang on. I'm sure I saw some YouTube video about this lighthouse once on Twitter, and some bloke was doing exactly that. It rings a vague bell. I'm not sure about using the lighthouse. I haven't ruled it out, though. Maybe we could get it in the background when they have dinner. There's an outside terrace and a lawn that runs down to the edge of the southwest coast path." "Sounds cool. Let's go and meet Clara King." The plush reception, which smelled of vanilla, was being manned by a pretty 20-something girl who greeted them with polished professionalism and phoned to let Clara know they were here. Poppy glanced up at a plaque over reception which said simply, "We're here to help you make your dreams come true." She really hoped that was true. This pilot was the pinnacle of a long-held dream for her. If Netflix greenlit the series, wow, the world really was her oyster. Oyster being an appropriate metaphor for a show by the sea. She planned to sell the rights worldwide for spin-offs. It could be franchised. The arrival of Clara interrupted her fantasy. Like the first time they'd met, she was immaculately dressed in a gorgeous, stylish pale lemon suit and sported a huge smile. "How lovely to see you again, Poppy." "And you, Clara?" She gestured to Dave. "This is Dave Blackwell, our director of photography." Clara held out her hand. "It's great to meet you, Mr. Blackwell. We're all very excited to be involved with Beauty Spot Productions." "Dave, please," he said, shaking her hand. "Would you like to eat first or look around?" Poppy knew the answer to that one, and Dave confirmed it. "I think we'd like to eat first." "Then let me take you both through to meet Phil Grimshaw, our maitre d'." Moments later, they were being introduced to a darkly handsome man who was so attractive Poppy did a double take. It wasn't just the tall, dark and handsome bit, although that would have been enough. But he had that head-turning presence that you can't manufacture, however well you dress and however tall you stand. "Good evening, sir, madam." Good grief, he had the voice too, deep and smooth. He'd have made a great Heathcliff. After he'd shown them to their table in a discreetly lit corner and left them to study leather-clad menus, Dave leaned forward and said in a stage whisper, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" "We've got to have him on the show," she said. "He's magnificent." "He's got to be an actor, hasn't he?" "Do you recognise him?" "No, but he might be a stage actor. He's got that kind of voice, Shakespearean. Reminds me of Patrick Stewart." "Patrick Stewart with a lot more hair," Poppy replied. "You know what I mean." "I do. I'll do some investigating. Did you notice if he was wearing a ring?" "No ring, no white mark. Which doesn't mean he's single, of course. How can someone that good-looking be single? I almost fancy him myself." "I don't," Poppy lied, "but I suspect I'm in the minority. He's the archetypal romantic hero, isn't he? The camera would love him. So would her intended audience. What idealistic lady between 18 and 80 didn't love a romantic hero? She wondered if he could be persuaded to change his name. Phil Grimshaw wasn't the sexiest of monikers. She dragged her gaze away from the maitre d', who was talking to a couple on another table. In the meantime, what do you fancy for dinner? It's on me. In that case, I'll have a T-bone. He shot a look at the prices. It's not too exorbitant either, is it? Why haven't you brought me here before? She laughed. We will definitely be coming again. They ordered soft drinks as they were both driving, steak for Dave and sea bass and samphire for her. It's the catch of the day, she said. How can I resist? Anyway, when you're by the sea, you should take advantage of the local produce. It says in the menu that all their produce is sourced from local suppliers. So I reckon I am, he countered swiftly. My steak was probably born and bred up the road. While they waited for their main courses, they talked shop. The date selection process would make up most of the 50-minute finished programme. The actual date would take a day to film, but would only take up the last few minutes of the show, the climax being when the happy couple announced live on air whether they had a future. This was a tried and tested formula for a dating show, but there was nothing wrong with tried and tested formulas, and what would make Poppy's show different would be that they were filming on location at some of the most fabulous beauty spots in the UK. She'd named her company with that in mind. Her intention was to put UK coastal towns back on the map, starting with Dorset. It was her home, and she loved it. She adored everything about the seaside county where she'd been born and brought up. Her mother always said they had the best of both worlds. They had the sea on one side and the New Forest on the other. But Poppy felt more drawn to the sea than the forest. Like her father and her brothers, she felt as though she too had seawater running through her veins. Dad had been on her mind a lot today. She guessed it wasn't surprising. He'd have been really proud, and she knew there was a part of her that was doing this for him, honouring his life and his love of the sea, as their mother had said they should. Penny for them. Dave's voice broke into her thoughts, and Poppy glanced at him across the snowy linen tablecloth. Sorry, I was miles away. So I saw. Was it anywhere interesting? I was thinking about my father, actually. She sighed, and Dave's eyes softened. He knew the story. You got to know the important things about someone when you worked long hours alongside them. He was a lifeboatman, wasn't he? I'm guessing that being close to the sea must feel bittersweet. Yes and no. Dad would have loved what I'm doing. He was a born romantic. Her mother had told them all stories about their idealistic father all through their childhood, keeping his memory alive for his children, even though she'd found happiness with another man and eventually remarried. Poppy loved her for never letting the memory of her dad fade. I do wish he'd got to see us all grow up. She shook her head, surprised at her own nostalgia. The past wasn't a place she went very often. Gathering herself, she said, Losing Dad was bad, but I couldn't have picked a better stepdad. You can't ever replace your dad. But Kenny's great. I've known him for as long as I can remember. He and my parents were next-door neighbours forever. Dave chewed thoughtfully and swallowed. Wow. I was best friends with his daughter Alice when we were small. Alice is 4 years older. She was the ultimate older sister. Glamorous, clever, kind. I idolised her when we were kids. I used to copy everything she did. Hair, makeup, clothes. It must have driven her mad. But she never got impatient with me. I felt that about my brother. I was forever copying his makeup and pinching his dresses. She laughed. That's one of the things I like about you. You never let me wallow in the past. To be fair, you don't usually do a lot of wallowing. And as it happens, I'm telling you about Alice for a reason. She put down her knife and fork. Is it that she's single and has a hankering to go on a date with a handsome cameraman? He wiped his mouth with a serviette and sat up straighter in his chair. It's fine for you to give her my number. You don't need to ask. You're not that far from the truth as it happens. Alice is single and looking for a date, not necessarily with a handsome cameraman. His mouth took a downturn. She decided she'd teased him enough. You will get to meet her, though. She's the star of Date for a Day. Wow, this project really is close to home for you, isn't it? She blinked. We'd better make sure it's a stonking great success then, hadn't we, boss? That's the plan, she said lightly. I'll have got all my ducks in a row as far as contestants go within the next month. Contestants and backup contestants. They both glanced back towards Phil Grimshaw, who picked up on their combined gaze with some sixth sense and turned inquiringly as a good maitre d' should. He's coming over, Poppy said. Will you ask him, or shall I? Chapter 3. Is everything okay? Phil Grimshaw was now standing by their table, which gave Poppy the opportunity to study him more closely. He had dark hair that was just on the right side of unruly, with the tiniest hints of grey at the temples and eyes that were almost black. His manner was coolly polite. She'd met a few maitre d's on her travels, and he definitely wasn't one of the obsequious variety. There was nothing remotely camp about him either. He was stern, but not sneering, although she was picking up definite hints of bad boy behind that polished veneer. Poppy had been intending to ask him a few leading questions, but instead she found herself blurting, My friend and I were just wondering if you can ride or, water ski? I have ridden horses. He was managing not to let incredulity slide into his voice, but it was in his eyes. Clearly, he thought she was crazy. Are you an actor? She continued. I am. His face cleared a little. There was the slightest of pauses, and she jumped to fill it. I'm Poppy Allen, and this is Dave Blackwell. I own a production company. She broke off because he was nodding. I know who you are, Ms. Allen. Mr. Blackwell. It's good to meet you. Of course he would know. Clara King was that kind of manager. She wouldn't have neglected to tell her key staff who was dining in their restaurant. Before she had gathered herself again, Phil went on smoothly. I understand we will be hosting beauty spot productions for an exciting venture in the spring. He hesitated, and she was in charge again. You understand correctly, and seem to know the details. What kind of acting do you do? Mostly theatre. I do some voiceover work too. I do whatever pays the bills, if that doesn't sound too mercenary, and of course, whatever fits around my work here. Of course. That was what every actor did. They all had day jobs with flexible hours until they landed that elusive role. Acting was like every other creative job, writing, painting, being a musician. There were thousands of people who dreamed of making it their career, but only a very small minority ever made enough money not to need a backup income. Do you have a card? She asked him. Maybe I could speak to you when you're not working? I will make sure you have one before you leave. Thank you. When he'd gone, Dave said, Did I imagine it, or did you get a teeny bit flustered then, Miss Allen? You imagined it. Like I said, he's not my type. She changed the subject pointedly. He'd be an asset to the show, though, wouldn't he? And he's local, so the expenses wouldn't be too high. And I do think he's Alice's type. That's a definite plus. The truth was, Poppy thought as she crawled into bed utterly exhausted at around midnight, it had been a very long day. She didn't really know what her own type was anymore. Most of her friends from uni were now married with kids. At the age of 33, some were even on their second attempt. But she hadn't dipped a toe in the water once, although with regards to matrimony, she'd come close. His name was Stephen Knight, and she had given him 5 whole years of her life. She had loved him unconditionally and utterly between the ages of 24 and 29. In fact, she'd loved him a bit longer than that. She'd fallen for him the first time she'd ever seen him on a stage with a microphone in his hand when she was 23 and he was 24, and he had blown her a kiss across the hot, jiggling, tousled heads of the crowd. She and her best friend since year 4, Serena Richards, had joked that Stephen was her knight in shining armour. And against all the odds, this became a reality. Stephen Knight was a postman by day and by night the lead singer of the Bandits, who did gigs on the local pub circuit. He was tall and pale, the latter mostly due to lack of sleep, and he was a hugely talented singer-songwriter. He also had a work ethic, passion, and enough determination to persuade a minor record label to sign him up when he was 25. As it turned out, he lived at the end of her parents' road in Poole, or she might never have met him for real. She had recognised him and told him how much of a fan she was, and he'd asked her for a coffee. They'd hit it off instantly. He told her later, with his usual eloquence, that he'd fallen for her smile and her golden hair. She told him with a boldness she hadn't known she possessed until that moment that she had fallen for his wonderfully talented lips. She'd glanced at them as she'd spoken, and he'd leaned forward and kissed her. Bobby had known then, with that total and utter certainty with which 24-year-olds knew all things, that he was the one for her. For the next few years they had dated in between his tours, and on her 29th birthday he had proposed, and they had spent the next 10 months planning a glittering wedding and a star-studded reception to be followed by a honeymoon in the Maldives. Stephen had not become the household name his record label had predicted, but he had made enough money to be wealthy.